I was elbow-deep in a dumpster behind a foreclosed mansion when I heard laughter that could have sliced through concrete. "Look at her," my mother's voice carried from the other side of the fence. "Grace is digging through trash again, she's nothing but a failure." My sister's laugh followed sharp and mean. "She chose that life. Let her stay in the gutter." Then my father's voice flat as stone. "She's not family anymore." I froze my hand, gripping the splintered leg of a broken chair. Dust clung to my jeans, the morning sun unforgiving on my skin. 10 years ago, I was the pride of the Ellington name, architectural prodigy, the girl who'd win awards and revive the family legacy. Now, I was the ghost they mocked between brunches. Before I could speak, a black car stopped at the curb. A woman in a tailored suit stepped out, heels clicking on pavement. "Miss Grace Ellington?" she asked. My family turned as one. I swallowed hard. "That's me," I said, voice raw. "If you're here to repo something, I'm afraid this chair leg is all I own." The woman smiled faintly. "I'm Olivia Park, attorney representing the estate of Mr. Alexander Ellington." My uncle's name struck me like lightning. "Mr. Ellington passed away 6 weeks ago," she continued. "He left you his entire estate, worth approximately $2 billion. Behind me, my mother gasped, and my father's face drained of color. My sister screamed. I stood there, dirt under my nails, the word billion echoing in my skull like a siren. Olivia held out a folder, embossed with gold lettering, Ellington Design Group. "We should speak privately," she said, glancing at my parents' open mouths. "Preferably somewhere other than a driveway." My mother snapped first. "This is absurd. Alexander wouldn't leave her a penny. She's been nothing but a disgrace." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Ellington, the documents are notarized and filed with the state. Your brother's wishes are clear." My father stepped forward, his voice trembling with rage. He was senile. "I'll contest it." "You're welcome to try," Olivia replied smoothly. "But the will names Miss Grace Ellington as the sole beneficiary and controlling shareholder of Ellington Design. Contesting it would be futile." My father's lips twitched, searching for words. My sister Lydia whispered, "It should have been me." I looked at them, my entire family lined up, like strangers' faces twisted with greed and disbelief. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I just felt done. I tossed the broken chair leg into the dumpster, the clatter sharp and final. "Well," I said, quietly, "guess the trash paid off." Olivia gestured toward the Mercedes. "We have a lot to discuss. There's also a message your uncle left for you, something that must be opened in person at the Ellington estate in Savannah." Savannah, the city I'd sworn never to return to, the place where my dreams had been born and buried. "Savannah," I repeated, tasting the name like an old wound. Lydia scoffed. "She can't even afford a bus ticket." Olivia didn't miss a beat. "The estate's private jet will take us tonight." The look on my family's faces was almost cinematic: shock, envy, fear. My mother clutched my father's arm. "You can't just let her waltz back into that world," she hissed. He sneered. "She'll ruin everything Ellington built." I met his eyes. I thought I already did. Then I turned away. The Mercedes smelled like leather and quiet power. As the driver pulled off, I caught a last glimpse of my parents' house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Lydia's silhouette blurred in the morning haze, her mouth still moving in disbelief. Olivia watched me with calm interest. "You seem remarkably composed." "I'm not," I admitted. "But after years of being called worthless, finding out I'm a billionaire's heir feels like the universe finally remembered I exist." Olivia smiled slightly. "Mr. Ellington never forgot you." I looked out the window at the passing streets, familiar yet foreign. "He had every reason to," I murmured. I walked away from him, from everything. The ride to the hotel felt unreal. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, part disbelief, part exhaustion. Olivia briefed me on logistics, estate transfer, corporate responsibilities, legal meetings in Savannah. "Your uncle's passing has left a power vacuum," she said. "The board expects a fight over leadership." Some already assume you'll refuse the position. They might be right, I said, half laughing. I've been homeless for months. The last thing I know how to do is run a billion-dollar firm. Then it's a good thing Mr. Ellington believed you could. Her confidence unsettled me more than the money. At a red light, Olivia turned to me. Grace, when was the last time you spoke to your uncle? 10 years, I said softly. We argued about my marriage. He said I was throwing my future away. I told him he was jealous of my independence. We never spoke again. He updated his will 3 years ago, she said. You were still listed as sole heir. I blinked. He never removed me, no. In fact, he added something new, the message I mentioned. He called it a blueprint for redemption. The phrase sank deep into me. Redemption. I'd spent so long trying to survive that I'd forgotten what it felt like to imagine anything better. He really thought I'd come back someday, I asked. He was certain of it, Olivia said. He told me you were the only one who understood his vision for architecture as something more than profit, a way to rebuild lives. I stared at my dirt-streaked hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent months sifting through other people's trash, yet somehow I was supposed to rebuild an empire. We reached the hotel near the coast, a boutique place far above anything I'd seen in years. Olivia handed me a key card. Get some rest. Tomorrow we fly to Savannah. Mr. Ellington's office, the estate, everything, it's all waiting for you. I hesitated at the door. You really think I can do this? I don't think, she said simply. I know. He trained people his whole life, but he only prepared one successor. I stood there in the quiet hallway, the words hanging between us. Successor. It felt like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Inside, I dropped my duffel bag on the bed and sat in silence. The room was immaculate: white sheets, gold accents, a view of the ocean shimmering like glass. My reflection in the mirror startled me: sunken eyes, tangled hair. The face of someone who'd been fighting too long. I thought about my family's laughter, the venom in their voices. I thought about the uncle I'd loved, the one man who'd ever believed I could design something extraordinary. Maybe this was his final lesson, forcing me to confront what I'd become. I showered until the water ran cold, watching the dirt swirl down the drain like the last traces of who I used to be. Then I opened my old notebook, its edges frayed, sketches smudged from time. Buildings that lived and breathed, designs for shelters that could grow with communities, dreams I'd drawn when I still believed the world had room for my ideas. I traced one line, whispering, maybe it's not too late. Outside, waves hit the shore with rhythmic certainty, like the heartbeat of a life restarting. At dawn, I packed my few belongings, the notebook, a worn coat, and the small pendant my uncle had given me at graduation, a compass engraved with the words, "Find your north." I hadn't looked at it in years. When Olivia arrived in the lobby, she greeted me with her usual calm. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Better than I have in months." She nodded toward the car. "Our flight leaves at 10. Savannah is expecting you." I smiled faintly. "I doubt they'll be thrilled." "Perhaps not," she said. "But destiny rarely waits for approval." As we drove toward the airport, the city blurred into a smear of gray and gold. I thought about what waited ahead: an empire I didn't build, a name I'd nearly destroyed, a second chance I wasn't sure I deserved. But as the plane took off and the clouds swallowed the world below, one thought drowned out everything else. Maybe this time I wouldn't run from who I was. Maybe this time I'd prove them all wrong. Bant de Noy. The ocean murmured against the shore outside my hotel window, but sleep refused to come. The bed was too soft after months of concrete floors and borrowed couches. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's smirk, my father's disappointment, my sister's contempt. Yet over it all, I kept hearing another voice, my Uncle Alexander's, steady, warm, impossible to forget. "You were born to build, Grace, not to follow." The words circled in my mind as I sat at the small desk, laptop open, glow painting my tired face. I typed Ellington Design Group into the search bar. There, it was, an empire of glass and ambition. A banner photo showed my uncle standing beside the Savannah skyline, silver hair catching the sun, the caption reading, "Alexander Ellington, the man who built hope out of steel." I stared at his face, remembering the last time we'd spoken 10 years ago, our argument echoing through his study. Back then I was 21, fresh out of UCLA's architecture program, reckless with certainty. I'd just won a National Student Design Award for a sustainable housing project, and Alexander had told me to pack my bags. "You'll start at Ellington Design this summer," he said proudly. "We'll make history together." Then Ethan Monroe walked into my life. He was 32, all charm and confidence, a tech entrepreneur, with a smile that could convince anyone they were extraordinary. He came to my exhibition, stood before my model of a green community center, and said, "This is what the future looks like." I thought he meant me. We started seeing each other. Dinners in downtown Los Angeles weekend, drives along the coast, long talks about innovation and change. I told myself I'd found someone who understood me, someone who saw the world through the same lens of creation. When he proposed 6 months later, I said yes without hesitation. Alexander didn't come to the wedding. He'd called me the night before. "You're making a mistake," he said. "That man doesn't want a partner, Grace. He wants a mirror. And he'll shatter it the moment you stop reflecting him." I'd shouted back through tears, "You're just jealous that I'm choosing my own path." He sighed, weary. "No, I'm heartbroken because you're throwing away everything you worked for. But it's your life to waste." We never spoke again. The first year of marriage felt like living inside a fairy tale carved from glass, fragile, beautiful, and destined to break. Ethan was charming in public, attentive when others were watching. He told me not to worry about work, that his success could support us both. "Why stress yourself, Grace?" he'd say. "You've earned a rest. Enjoy life for a while." At first I believed him. I told myself I'd start applying for firms after we settled in San Diego. But months turned into years. Every time I mentioned wanting to return to architecture, Ethan found a reason to delay. "We're traveling next month," or "Let's start a family first," or "The market's too unstable." His words always sounded logical until I realized they were walls. When I tried to freelance from home, small designs, additions for neighbors, he'd schedule last-minute dinners or business trips. I'd cancel deadlines, apologize to clients. Eventually, the offers stopped coming. My only rebellion was secret. Late at night, while Ethan snored beside me, I'd read architectural journals on my phone, sketch in notebooks, design imaginary projects that would never exist. I filled 17 of those notebooks over the years, pages of impossible dreams, bridges, community gardens, low-cost housing, green rooftops. I never showed them to anyone. One night, Ethan found them. He flipped through the pages, smiling in that patronizing way he'd perfected. "This is cute," he said, "but maybe focus on keeping the house nice. The Johnsons are coming for dinner." The word cute felt like acid on my skin. The first affair I ignored. The second I confronted. The third broke me. I'd found the messages on his laptop, flirty emails with his assistant, dinner receipts, hotel reservations. When I asked, he didn't deny it. He just shrugged. "You're too sensitive, Grace. Don't make a scene." The divorce was brutal. His lawyers were sharks. Mine were overworked volunteers. The prenup left me with nothing, no house, no savings, not even the car. I packed what I could into one suitcase and left. I thought I could go home. When I showed up at my parents' house, my mother met me at the door. "We can't have you staying here," she said, glancing at the neighbors' windows. "People talk." My father added, "You made your bed. Lie in it." Lydia, my sister, smirked from the hallway. "Guess genius doesn't pay after all." I left without another word. The months after that blurred together, shelters, cheap motels, sleeping in my car. I sold furniture I'd found on curbs, cleaned it, painted it, sold it again online. Some nights I cried over splinters and chipped paint, but it was still mine, my work, my effort. There were days I almost called Alexander, but shame stopped me. He'd been right all along. I was too proud to let him hear me broken. One evening, sitting on the curb outside a warehouse, I opened one of my old notebooks. My sketches looked childish at first glance, But as I flipped through, I saw growth lines, surer forms, more daring. I whispered, maybe I can still be who I was. That night, I drew something new, a shelter made of recycled materials, modular, flexible, warm. I didn't have software, just pen and paper, but as I drew, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Architecture had been my first language. I was relearning how to speak it. The world didn't change overnight, but I did. Slowly, painfully. Each design I sold, online tables, chairs, small pieces, became a step out of the ashes. Now, sitting in this hotel room with a view of the Atlantic, I realized how far I'd come and how much further I had to go. I looked at the reflection in the window. Hollow cheeks, yes, but eyes burning again. I whispered, I'm not trash. I'm unfinished. A knock at the door startled me. Olivia Park stood there, composed, as always, holding an envelope. Your flight to Savannah leaves at noon, she said. I stared at her, heartbeat, loud in my ears. And that's where my uncle's office is. And his final message, she confirmed. I glanced down at my calloused hands, at the sketchbook open on the desk. Do you really think I can do this? I don't think, Olivia said simply. I know. Mr. Ellington wouldn't have left everything to you if he didn't. I packed the notebook, the pendant compass, a change of clothes. That was all I had, but somehow it felt like enough. On the drive to the airport, the city blurred past in streaks of light and shadow. I watched the horizon where dawn painted the sky pink and thought of Alexander's voice again. Brilliance means nothing without courage. When the plane lifted off, I pressed my forehead to the window. Clouds swallowed the world below. Somewhere beyond them waited a city I hadn't seen since childhood, and a legacy I wasn't sure I deserved. But as the engines roared, I realized something undeniable. I had already lost everything once. There was nothing left to fear. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally time to build again. The jet cut through the clouds like a blade, leaving the Pacific far behind. Below us, the world shrank into neat squares of ocean and earth. Olivia sat across from me, her posture immaculate even in turbulence, a folder balanced on her lap. Before we landed, she said there was something I needed to know. I turned from the window. Let me guess, I said, trying for humor. My uncle secretly owned an island too. Her lips curved slightly. Close. He owned an empire, and now you must decide whether you can run it. That silenced me. The hum of the engines seemed louder, heavier. I'd spent the last few weeks digging through trash for furniture, and now I was in a private jet headed to Savannah. It felt absurd, like a dream someone else was having. Olivia opened the folder and slid a document across the table. This is your uncle's last will and testament. He left you everything, his company, his properties, his investments. But there's a condition. I felt my throat tighten. A condition: you must assume the role of CEO of Ellington Design Group within 30 days of the reading of the will and maintain that position for at least 1 year. If you fail or refuse, everything, every dollar, every building goes to the American Institute of Architects. I stared at her. He expected me to run a billion-dollar firm. I don't even have a mailing address. Olivia looked unruffled. Mr. Ellington believed this would bring you back to who you truly are. I sank back into the leather seat. He could have brought me back with a phone call. He tried, she said quietly. You didn't answer. The words landed hard. I looked out the window where sunlight glinted off the wing. He always loved his lessons dramatic. Olivia's tone softened. He wanted you to rediscover your courage. You've spent 10 years surviving, Miss Ellington. He thought it was time you started living again. I wanted to be angry. But beneath the sting there was something else, hope maybe, or the ghost of it. You really think he believed I could do this? He didn't believe, she said. He knew. For the rest of the flight I read the documents in silence. $2 billion. The number didn't feel real. Ellington Design Group, the company my uncle had built from nothing, had projects in London, New York, Tokyo. Its name was on museums, concert halls, civic buildings. And now, somehow, it was mine. But it wasn't just the wealth that daunted me. It was the expectation. My uncle had spent decades carving his philosophy into glass and steel that architecture could heal communities, not just decorate them. I wasn't sure I had that kind of faith anymore. Olivia closed her laptop. There's more. The firm is unsettled since Mr. Ellington's passing. The board is divided. Divided how half of them want to preserve your uncle's legacy. The other half want to sell the company to a rival conglomerate, Grant and Weaver Holdings. The CEO, Oliver Grant, was once your uncle's protégé. Their philosophies clashed, and Mr. Ellington forced him out 5 years ago. He's been waiting for a chance to take over ever since. I exhaled slowly, so I'm walking into a battlefield. Olivia nodded. One that your uncle expected you to win. Wonderful, I muttered. Nothing like inheriting a war. When we descended toward Savannah, the window filled with green and gold live oaks draped in Spanish moss rivers, catching the sunrows of historic buildings that looked like they'd grown straight from the earth. I hadn't seen this city in 15 years, not since I was a teenager visiting Alexander's estate during summers. I remembered him walking me through job sites, his hand warm on my shoulder saying, "Look closely, Grace. Every building breathes. Listen long enough, and it'll tell you its story." As the wheels touched the runway, Olivia said, "The board meeting is tomorrow. They'll expect you to decline. Most people would. Good thing I'm not most people," I said, though my hands were trembling in my lap. We drove from the airport through streets lined with magnolias. The city was both familiar and foreign, like a photograph I'd stepped inside. When the car turned a corner, my breath caught. There, rising above the trees, was the Ellington Design headquarters. 3 stories of brick and glass old-world charm wrapped around modern innovation. I pressed my palm against the window. "I used to draw this building in my notebooks." "Now you own it," Olivia said simply. But instead of excitement, I felt the weight of every failure pressing down on me. For 10 years I'd been told I was nothing. Could I really become something again in 30 days? We crossed the bridge toward the riverfront. The Ellington estate came into view, a sprawling mansion of red brick and white columns, its reflection shimmering in the water. The last time I saw it, I'd been leaving in tears. Margaret, the housekeeper who'd known me since childhood, was waiting at the gate. She was older, slower, but her eyes still kind. "Miss Grace," she said, her voice breaking. "Welcome home." The words hit me harder than I expected. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and memory. The foyer opened to a sweeping staircase, paintings of Ellington ancestors lining the walls, engineers, architects, dreamers. I paused before a portrait of Alexander himself, painted just a few years before his death. His eyes seemed to follow me. "Your uncle left something for you in his study," Margaret said softly. The room hadn't changed. The same drafting table by the window, the same leather chair, the same model of the Bridge of Light, the first structure he'd ever let me help him design when I was 15. I ran a hand over it, dust motes swirling in the sunlight. On the desk sat a sealed envelope. My name in his unmistakable handwriting. Olivia lingered at the door. "He said you should read it here." I broke the seal with trembling fingers. "My dearest Grace," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to reach you in life, but found you in legacy. I was angry when you left, not because you disappointed me, but because I saw the fire in you dim. I built this company from ashes. You will rebuild it from yours." Tears blurred the ink. "You are my heir not because of blood, but because you see beauty where others see ruin. The board will test you. Let them. They'll see what I saw in you, brilliance born from resilience. Lead, learn, outlast." I pressed the paper to my chest, the scent of old ink and cedar wrapping around me like his embrace. Olivia's voice was soft behind me. "He never stopped believing you'd return." I turned, blinking back tears. "He had a strange way of showing it. He trusted you more than you trust yourself." Outside, the Savannah light filtered through the oaks, warm and golden. For the first time, I felt it, not the weight of inheritance, but the possibility of redemption. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood on the balcony of the guest room, looking over the gardens Alexander had designed decades ago. The fountain glimmered under moonlight, and beyond it the city lights flickered like distant stars. Maybe he was right. Maybe the only way to honor him was to prove that the fire he'd seen in me hadn't died, it had just been buried. Tomorrow I would walk into that boardroom face the people who doubted me and claim what was mine. Not the money, not even the company, but the chance to build again. I looked down at the compass pendant around my neck. The needle glinted under the moon, pointing steadily north. I whispered, "I hear you, Uncle. I'm coming home." Fog drifted low across the savannah morning as the car turned through the wrought iron gates of the Ellington estate. Dew shimmered on the grass, and the old trees bent over the path like guardians whispering a welcome or a warning. I pressed my palm against the window, heart pounding. The mansion rose ahead of us all, red brick and marble columns, sunlight touching its windows like fire. The last time I'd walked those steps, I was a defiant girl shouting at my uncle. Now, I was his heir, returning with nothing but his belief to hold me up. Olivia sat beside me, scrolling through her tablet, calm as always. "Your uncle had the estate restored 10 years ago. He said he wanted it to wait for you exactly as you remembered." I swallowed. "He really thought I'd come back." "He knew you would," she said, closing the tablet. "He told me Grace will come home when she's ready to build again." The car stopped at the base of the steps. Margaret stood waiting, hands clasped in front of her apron, tears shining in her eyes. "Miss Grace," she said as I stepped out, voice trembling. "Welcome home." The words hit me harder than I expected. I hugged her before I could think. "You haven't aged a day," I said, though the silver in her hair told another story. "Oh, I've aged plenty," she laughed softly. "But seeing you here, it feels like time finally caught up." Inside, the estate smelled of polished wood and lemon oil, like the past carefully preserved. Paintings lined the hallway, Ellington ancestors, staring down in silent judgment or pride, I couldn't tell which. At the end of the corridor, sunlight spilled into the great room. This was his favorite space, Margaret said. He used to sit by the windows every morning and sketch the light. I walked toward the desk by the window. It was immaculate, a museum of his mind rulers, graphite pencils, stacks of blueprints tied with silk cord. In the center lay a single model, a bridge suspended by elegant arcs of glass and steel. I recognized it instantly. "The Bridge of Light," I whispered. "We designed it together." I was 15. Margaret's smile deepened. "He never changed it. Said it reminded him of you." I ran my fingers over the model, the smooth edges of the steel. Every part of this house hummed with his presence, a ghost not haunting, but waiting. That's when I noticed a letter resting under the lamp, sealed with gold wax, and my name written in his steady hand. Olivia stepped forward. "He asked that you read it here in his study." My hands trembled as I broke the seal. "My dear Grace," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means the world has lost me but found you again. I was too stubborn in life to say what needed saying. So I'm saying it now. You were right to chase your own path, even if it broke my heart. The world will try to make you smaller. Don't let it. I built this company from ashes. You will rebuild it from yours. You are my heir, not by blood but by spirit. The only one who still believes architecture can heal. The board will test you. Let them. You are stronger than they remember." Tears blurred the words, but I kept reading. "Lead bravely. Learn fiercely. Outlast everything that doubts you. A.E." When I looked up, Olivia was watching quietly. "He believed every word of that," she said. I folded the letter carefully, pressing it to my chest. "Then I'll try to earn it." We left the study and drove toward the city center. Savannah glowed in the afternoon sun, moss-draped oaks, framing the street's river light flickering on cobblestones. And then there it was, the Ellington Design Group headquarters. It stood tall and proud, a fusion of past and present, the original brick facade of the 19th century warehouse, intertwined with modern glass and steel, sunlight spilling through open atriums. People in sleek suits passed through the revolving doors, oblivious to the legacy they walked within. Inside the lobby was vast, echoing with footsteps and faint music from somewhere above. The reception desk curved like a wave behind it, a wall engraved with the company's motto, "Architecture is redemption made visible." I stopped in front of it, fingers tracing the engraved words. He really believed that. Olivia nodded. "So should you." A low voice cut through the air. "Miss Ellington, I presume." I turned. The man who approached was tall, impeccably dressed with salt and pepper hair and an expression honed by boardrooms. His eyes, gray and calculating, took me in like a problem to be solved. "Oliver Grant," he said, extending his hand. "Former senior partner under your uncle. Current advisor to the board." I shook at his grip, firm, cold. "So, you're the prodigal protege," I said before I could stop myself. He smirked. "And you're the prodigal niece. We've both returned to claim the same throne." The tension in the air was electric. Olivia intervened smoothly. "Mr. Grant, the board meeting begins at 2. Miss Ellington will be there." Oliver's eyes stayed on mine. "Don't be late," he said. "This isn't a family reunion." He walked away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken threats. I exhaled slowly. "Charming." "Clever," Olivia corrected. "And dangerous." We took the elevator up to the top floor. The walls were lined with awards magazine covers, models of projects from around the world. Each one whispered of my uncle's brilliance, and the pressure of living up to it pressed against my chest. Before the meeting, Olivia said, "You should see something. Nathan Cole has been expecting you." The elevator doors opened to a bright workspace filled with sketches and 3D models. A man stood near the window, his sleeves rolled up, hair tousled by the wind from an open vent. When he turned, I recognized the kind of gaze only true architects have, always seeing beyond what exists. "Nathan Cole," he said, crossing the room with an easy smile. "Senior architect. I worked with your uncle for 12 years. I shook his hand, surprised by his warmth. "The Nathan Cole who designed the Chicago Glass Pavilion." His eyebrows rose. "You know my work, I studied it. You used biophilic geometry before it became trendy." His smile deepened. "You've still got the eye." "I never lost it," I said softly. "Just forgot to use it." He gestured to the table. "Your uncle started this project before he passed the Savannah Cultural Pavilion. He wanted it to bridge the community and the riverfront. The board shelved it after his death. Oliver called it sentimental." I looked at the model, fluid lines rising like a wave of light. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "It shouldn't be collecting dust." Nathan's voice lowered. "He always said you'd finish what he couldn't." The weight of his faith settled around me again, but this time it felt less like pressure and more like purpose. Before we left, Nathan handed me a folder. "Your uncle left this for you too. Plans, ideas, sketches. He called it Unfinished Symphonies. Thought you might want to see them." I smiled faintly. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Olivia glanced at her watch. "We have 15 minutes before the board meeting. They'll expect you to decline the role." "Then I won't give them what they expect," I said, gripping the folder tighter. We walked down the corridor toward the glass conference room. The doors were etched with the Ellington crest shimmering under the lights. Behind them, I could see shadows moving, 8 figures, waiting to decide if I belonged. Nathan caught my eye from across the hall. "They'll test you," he said. "But remember, you already passed his." I took a deep breath. For the first time, I said, "I'm not the woman who lost everything. I'm the woman about to take it back." The clock struck 2. I reached for the handle, pushed open the doors, and stepped into the light. The room fell silent as I stepped inside. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me, calculating, skeptical, already judging. A long glass table stretched the length of the conference room, polished to a mirror shine. At the head sat Oliver Grant, hands folded neatly over a stack of papers, his smile sharp as cut steel. "Gentlemen and ladies," Olivia announced, her voice cool and professional. "This is Miss Grace Ellington, Mr. Alexander Ellington's niece and legal heir. As of today, she assumes ownership of Ellington Design Group, pending her decision regarding the CEO position." A thin man with silver hair leaned back in his chair. Ownership is one thing, Miss Park. Leadership is another. With respect, Miss Ellington has never managed a company, let alone one of this scale. Oliver didn't bother to hide his smirk. Precisely. This firm requires experience, not sentiment. I took the seat at the opposite end of the table, meeting every gaze head-on. My uncle didn't build this company on sentiment. He built it on vision. And vision is something I haven't lost. A few eyebrows lifted, but most of them stayed silent. I reached into my bag and pulled out one of my old sketchbooks, its edges frayed from years of hiding. I slid it down the table toward the silver-haired man. That's 10 years of work, I said. Designs drawn when no one thought I'd ever pick up a pencil again. They're proof that vision doesn't die, it just waits for the right moment to surface. He opened it reluctantly. As he flipped through the pages, his expression softened surprise, replacing disdain. Oliver's voice broke the quiet. Interesting art project. But running a billion-dollar architecture firm isn't a charity case. I looked directly at him. No, it's not. Which is why I'm not asking for charity. I'm taking responsibility. That drew a ripple of whispers around the table. Olivia stepped forward, distributing folders. Per Mr. Ellington's will, Miss Ellington is to assume the role of CEO effective immediately. The board's role is advisory during the transition period. Your signatures will confirm acknowledgement. Oliver's hand shot up. Point of order. The firm's bylaws require a vote of confidence from the board to approve any incoming executive. Olivia's smile was razor-thin. True, but the bylaws also give the majority shareholder final authority, and Miss Ellington holds 51% of the company. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Oliver's jaw tightened. So, this is how it's going to be? Yes, I said softly. This is how it's going to be. The silver-haired man cleared his throat. If I may, Miss Ellington? What exactly are your intentions for Ellington Design Group? Your uncle had ideals, admirable ones. But ideals don't always keep the lights on. I leaned forward, steady. My uncle believed architecture could heal. That belief built this firm's reputation. Somewhere along the way, that vision turned into ego and profit margins. I intend to bring it back. A woman at the table, sharp suit, sharp eyes, spoke for the first time. And how do you plan to do that? I stood, walked to the whiteboard behind me, and picked up a marker. My hand trembled only slightly. By doing what architects do best, designing solutions, I drew the outline of a city block fast and sure. Savannah's East Riverfront. It's been neglected for years. My uncle dreamed of transforming it into a public space, a fusion of sustainability, culture, and community. A living showcase of what Ellington Design stands for. Oliver's voice dripped with disdain. You're proposing we take on a non-profit vanity project. I'm proposing we honor the foundation that made this company matter, I replied. The project would merge commercial viability with social purpose. Public pavilions, renewable energy, mixed-use structures, green roofing, architecture that breathes. The woman leaned forward. And how do you plan to fund this partnerships? I said. Corporate sponsors, cultural grants, municipal support. The same way my uncle built his first museum in Atlanta. By making people believe in something bigger than blueprints. The room fell quiet again. Nathan, seated near the back, met my eyes with a faint nod. Oliver laughed low and sharp. You think you can waltz in here with a sentimental story and sketches from your college days and convince the world you belong? This company was my life for 20 years before your uncle pushed me out. Then you should understand what it means to fight for something, I said evenly. Because I will. His smile froze. The silver-haired board member closed my sketchbook carefully. You have conviction, Miss Ellington. I'll give you that. But conviction won't save us if this company falters. Maybe not, I said. But indifference will destroy us faster. Olivia placed her pen on the table. The decision stands. Miss Ellington is CEO. Chairs scraped against marble as the meeting adjourned. Some board members left quickly, murmuring among themselves. The woman who'd asked about funding approached me on her way out. "You have your uncle's fire," she said quietly. "Don't let them extinguish it." When the last person left, only Nathan, Olivia, and Oliver remained. Oliver leaned against the table, eyes glinting. "You're playing a dangerous game, Grace. The board respects results, not speeches. You'll fail, and when you do, they'll come to me to clean up the mess." I walked closer until I was standing a foot away. "Maybe. But at least I'll fail on my own terms." For a moment his mask slipped. "You really think you can survive in this world?" I smiled faintly. "I already did. You just weren't watching." He stared at me, searching for weakness, then laughed under his breath. "We'll see." After he left, the tension drained from my shoulders. Nathan exhaled. "You handled that better than anyone expected." "I wasn't sure I could," I admitted. He grinned. "That's the secret. None of us ever are." We walked together down the hallway lined with glass offices. Outside, the city gleamed in the afternoon sun, the Savannah River glinting like silver. Nathan gestured toward the view. "He used to stand there every evening, you know. Your uncle said this city was his blueprint for redemption." I looked out at the skyline, glass reflecting gold. "Then maybe it's my turn to finish what he started." That evening, I returned to the estate alone. The air was cool, scented with jasmine. Inside the studio, my uncle's models glowed softly under dim light, museums, bridges, homes. The ghosts of his brilliance surrounded me. I opened my notebook again, flipping to a blank page. My hand hovered above it, unsure. Then I began to draw. The riverfront took shape beneath my pen, curves of light and glass gardens. Between walkways, people gathered where emptiness once lived. Halfway through, I realized I was crying. Not from sadness, but release. Every line felt like breathing again. When I finished, I whispered to the empty room, "I'll make you proud, Uncle." Outside, the city lights shimmered across the water. And somewhere in the distance, I swore I could hear his voice again, soft, certain, like the sound of wind through unfinished buildings. "Build bravely, Grace." The sun rose over the Savannah skyline like molten gold spilling across glass. From the window of my uncle's office, the city looked almost unaware of the storm that was about to hit. My first day as CEO, my first board presentation, my first chance to prove that Alexander Ellington hadn't made a mistake leaving everything to me. I stared at my reflection in the glass hair, pulled back navy blue suit, crisp, and borrowed from the wardrobe Margaret had arranged. It made me look like I belonged. That would have to be enough. Nathan appeared in the doorway holding 2 coffees. "You ready? Define ready," I said, taking one. He smiled. "Then you're ready enough." He set a thick folder on my desk. "The Riverfront Redevelopment Project. Your first battlefield." I opened it, scanning the blueprints. The design was ambitious: green roofs, solar shading, rain gardens, community spaces by the river. My uncle's old dream, now mine to defend. "The board will be there," Nathan said. "And Oliver, he's not expecting you to succeed. Then he's about to be disappointed." I left the office with the folder in one hand and my heart in the other. By 9:30, the conference room hummed with polite hostility. 8 board members filled their seats, coffee cups, steaming, murmurs slicing through the air. At the head of the table sat Oliver Grant, immaculate, as always, his smile sharp enough to cut. When he saw me, his expression flickered into amusement. "Miss Ellington, I was worried you might get lost on your way to the grown-up table." I set the folder on the desk and met his gaze. "I found my way just fine." "Good. Then, let's begin." Olivia nodded to me. "Miss Ellington will be presenting her proposal for the Riverfront Redevelopment Project." I connected my laptop to the projector. The screen lit up, then froze. A flashing message appeared. "File corrupted. Unable to open." My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing. Another error. My pulse roared in my ears. Oliver leaned back, voice smooth. "Technical difficulties already. Perhaps we should reschedule once you've learned how to use the equipment." A ripple of laughter broke around the room. I swallowed hard. The easy way out was to panic, to fumble, to retreat, But my uncle's voice came back to me from years ago, steady and low. An architect without courage is just a draftsman. I closed the laptop and walked to the glass wall behind me. No slides, I said. Let's build this the way architecture was meant to be built, by hand. I picked up a black marker and began to draw directly on the glass fluid lines, confident strokes, muscle memory returning like an old song. The board murmured, watching, as a river curved into view, as rooftops bloomed with greenery, as sunlight found its way into the spaces I sketched. This, I said, my voice steadying with every word, is the Savannah Riverfront Project. It's not just a redesign, it's a resurrection. The city has treated this area like a scar for years. We're going to make it breathe again. I added shaded blocks, labeling each mixed-use housing, public library, community garden, solar canopy. Someone at the far end of the table leaned forward. And how do you plan to make it sustainable? Through passive design, I said, without missing a beat. Green roofs to absorb runoff, angled facades for natural airflow, materials sourced locally. Every line has a purpose. The woman nodded, impressed despite herself. I turned back to the board. Buildings are living organisms. They should interact with their surroundings, not dominate them. The Riverfront Project isn't about profit. It's about legacy, and legacy pays dividends long after the last check clears. The room fell quiet. Oliver's smirk had vanished. That's lovely poetry, he said finally. But this firm doesn't run on philosophy. It runs on money. How do you plan to fund your idealism? By doing what Ellington Design has always done, I said. Inspire investors. Savannah's Chamber of Commerce has already expressed interest. I'll present this to them next week. He raised a brow. You've already contacted them, I smiled. Yesterday afternoon. For once, Oliver had no immediate reply. I capped the marker and stepped back. Questions, silence. Then, unexpectedly, applause from Nathan, firm and deliberate. One by one, others followed. Not everyone, but enough. A woman near the center said, Miss Ellington, that was compelling. You've got my support, another added. It's bold, risky, but bold is what this company used to be. Oliver's jaw tightened. We'll see how bold looks on a balance sheet. Then let's find out, I said. The meeting adjourned. People gathered their papers, murmuring as they left. Nathan waited until the last one was gone before breaking into a grin. You just turned sabotage into spectacle. Sabotage, I asked. He nodded toward my laptop. The corrupted file. Only 2 people had access to that system yesterday. You and Oliver. My breath caught. He wanted me to fail. Nathan shrugged. He underestimated you. He's going to regret that. Olivia approached, tablet in hand. The investors from the chamber want a follow-up next week. They're calling it the Ellington Revival. I laughed softly. For once, my name isn't being whispered with pity. Outside sunlight blazed through the glass wall where my sketches still glowed, the ink catching the light like steel. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot untied after years of tightening. Then Oliver appeared in the doorway. A word, Miss Ellington. Nathan shot me a look. I nodded. It's fine. Inside his office, the air was colder, sharper. Oliver closed the door. Enjoy your applause. One good drawing doesn't make you a CEO. No, I said. But it's a start. He walked around his desk, voice low. You think your uncle's name will protect you? This firm isn't a monument, it's a machine, and you don't know how to run it. I can learn. He smiled, humorless. You'll learn the hard way. He tossed something on the desk, a small flash drive. You should check your passwords next time. I stared at it. You sabotaged me. I tested you, he corrected. You passed. Barely. Then next time, I said, picking up the drive, make the test harder. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Careful, Grace. Pride's what killed your uncle. I met his gaze. No, compromise did. I walked out before he could answer. That night I returned to the studio on the top floor of the estate. The glass windows framed the city lights, glowing over the river like liquid fire. My drawings from the day still lingered in my mind, lines of hope against cynicism. I opened one of my old notebooks, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. Day 1. They tried to break me. Instead, they built me. Outside thunder rolled low across the horizon. The rain came soon after, steady and cleansing, washing the dust from the windows. I stood there for a long time, watching the river shimmer under the storm, and thought about my uncle's words, architecture is redemption made visible. Maybe I was finally beginning to understand what he meant. Tomorrow they'd test me again. And I'd be ready. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. It drummed softly against the glass roof of the estate studio, steady and comforting, like a heartbeat from the past. The city below shimmered under the storm-blurred lights reflected in the Savannah River. I sat at my uncle's old drafting table, the same one he'd used for decades, surrounded by the ghosts of his work. Models, sketches, photographs, all pieces of a life spent turning imagination into stone and steel. Yesterday's triumph still hummed faintly inside me. I had faced Oliver. Faced the board, faced my own fear. For the first time, I hadn't just survived, I'd led. But victory carried a strange quiet. Once the noise faded, all that remained was the echo of what came next. Margaret appeared in the doorway, holding a tray with tea, and the kind of patient smile only time could carve. "You skipped dinner again," she said gently. "I wasn't hungry," I murmured, eyes still on the desk. She set the tray down. "You've been staring at that filing cabinet for an hour. Whatever you're looking for, maybe it's time you open it." The cabinet had been locked since the day I arrived. Heavy old, with a brass keyhole polished by years of use. Earlier, while dusting, Margaret had found a small key taped beneath one drawer. On it, written in my uncle's handwriting, were 3 words, "For when she's ready." I turned the key in the lock. The drawer slid open with a soft groan, releasing a faint scent of cedar and dust. Inside were 17 leather-bound sketchbooks stacked carefully, each labeled by year. Beneath them lay a single envelope, yellowed at the edges. My name was written across it in that same familiar hand. My heart stuttered. "He was always a man of timing," I said quietly. Margaret touched my shoulder. "He left this for you. And those too." When she left, I sat there in silence, rain whispering on the glass above. I opened the envelope. "My dear Grace," the letter began. "You've probably opened this because you've stopped surviving and started leading. Good. You were born to build, not hide. I left you these sketchbooks not because they're masterpieces, but because they're failures. My failures. The world only remembers what we finished, never what we struggled through. But every great design starts as something broken. Inside these books, you'll find the things I couldn't complete, the ideas that beat me, the concepts that never came to life. You'll also find my heart scattered across the pages. Use them not as blueprints, but as reminders that brilliance is built from ruins. You'll understand soon." Tears blurred the words. I opened the first sketchbook. The pages crackled under my fingertips, filled with quick lines and furious notes. Early concept sketches of projects I recognized: the Atlanta Museum, the Bridge of Light, but also ones I'd never seen. The Garden Library, the Coastal Shelter, the Children's Museum of Light. Some were nearly complete, others were abandoned mid-page corners, smudged with frustration. Each page carried his voice, written in the margins in fading ink. Too ambitious, maybe Grace will see what I couldn't. Never delete mistakes, they're the foundation of progress. By the 3rd book, I was crying freely. Every note felt like a conversation we were finally having after 10 silent years. He hadn't left me perfection. He'd left me proof that even geniuses fail. I closed the book and whispered to the empty room, "I missed you, Uncle." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the rows of models like silent witnesses. My reflection looked different in the glass. Still tired, still human, but steadier. The door opened softly. Nathan stepped inside, soaked from the rain, his hair dripping onto his collar. "You didn't answer your phone," he said, holding up a folder. I thought something was wrong. I smiled faintly. Something's right for once. He looked at the table, the open sketchbooks, the letter in my hand. "What are these, his unfinished projects?" his mistakes, his lessons. He stepped closer, flipping through the nearest book. His eyes widened. Grace, these are incredible. Do you realize what you're holding? This is architectural history. No, I said softly. It's human history. It's what he wanted me to learn, that even legends struggle. Nathan watched me carefully. So, what will you do with them? I don't know yet, I admitted. But I can't let them stay buried in drawers, he nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time to finish what he started. We spent the next hour paging through the books together. Each sketch sparked a conversation, a question, a memory, an idea. Nathan told me stories about working with my uncle. How he pushed people beyond fear, how he demanded not perfection but honesty. Your uncle used to say architecture is empathy made visible, Nathan said. That every wall we build should protect someone's story. I laughed through the tears. He said the same thing to me when I was 15. When Nathan finally stood to leave, the rain had eased to a mist. You know, he said, pausing at the door he used to call you his unfinished masterpiece. I blinked. What he told me once, Grace will figure it out when she's ready. She just doesn't know she already has everything she needs. He left me with that thought, and for a while I just sat there staring at the storm. Later, I opened a blank notebook and began writing ideas for a new project. Not for profit, not for prestige, something for people like me. People who'd lost everything but still wanted to build. At the top of the page, I wrote the Ellington Fellowship. It would be a mentorship program for young architects from underprivileged backgrounds. Real projects, real pay, real experience. They would learn that architecture wasn't about ego, it was about impact. By midnight, the page was filled with sketches and notes. I could almost hear Alexander chuckling in approval. Margaret peeked in again, carrying a blanket. You're still awake. I'm working on something new. She glanced at the page, eyes widening. Your uncle dreamed of doing something like that. He wanted to give young designers a chance he never had. Then it's time we make that happen, I said. She smiled softly. He'd be proud of you, dear girl. When she left, I turned off the main lights, leaving only the desk lamp on. The storm had finally passed, and the first hints of dawn bled into the horizon. The studio glowed faintly, and in that golden half-light the sketches on the walls seemed to breathe. I walked to the far wall where a phrase was etched into the plaster in my uncle's handwriting. Architecture is redemption made visible. I ran my fingers over the words. Then, let's make it visible again. The city outside stirred awake, the hum of morning traffic, the low whistle of a train, the sound of new beginnings. I gathered the sketchbooks, stacked them neatly on the desk, and whispered, You kept the faith for me, Uncle. I'll keep it for them. As I left the studio, the sun broke fully over the river, painting the world in light. The ghosts didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt like guides. The sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ellington Design headquarters, catching the dust motes as they drifted through the air like golden confetti. I hadn't slept much the night before, too consumed with the new idea that had taken root in my mind. Now, as I stood before the same boardroom that had once tested me, I wasn't here to defend myself. I was here to change the company. Olivia set a folder in front of each board member. Miss Ellington requested this emergency meeting to propose a new division within Ellington Design Group. I stepped forward, palms steady on the table. I'm not proposing a division, I said. I'm proposing a revolution. A few skeptical chuckles rippled around the table, and Oliver's smirk widened. We're architects, not revolutionaries, Miss Ellington. Try to keep your metaphors grounded. I met his gaze without flinching. Grounded is exactly what I'm trying to change. I tapped the folder in front of them. The Ellington Fellowship, I began, will recruit 12 architecture students from across the country, diverse backgrounds, limited resources, immense potential. They'll work directly with our senior architects on real community-based projects, beginning with a prototype, the Savannah Community Library. Someone at the far end of the table frowned. A library. That doesn't exactly scream profit. Neither did my uncle's first museum in Atlanta, I said. And yet it became the cornerstone of our reputation. This isn't charity, it's strategy. Architecture built on integrity draws both clients and loyalty. Oliver leaned back in his chair. You're asking us to fund interns to play architect while you chase nostalgia. I smiled faintly. I'm asking us to invest in the future. Because without the next generation of designers, this firm will be nothing but a monument to the past. The silver-haired board member, Mr. Langford, spoke up. And what does this program cost? Phase 1, 6 months will operate from the innovation budget, I said, glancing toward Nathan, who gave a small nod. No external investors until we've proven its success. A low hum of whispers filled the room. Oliver's tone sharpened. You're gambling with our reputation. I turned toward him. You're the one who's forgotten what our reputation was built on. The tension thickened sharp enough to cut. Before Oliver could reply, Mrs. Porter, the only woman on the board, besides Olivia, closed her folder. I say we give her the year. 1 project, 1 trial. If it succeeds, we expand. If not, it dies quietly. Fair murmur of reluctant agreement moved around the table. Fine, Oliver said through clenched teeth. 1 year. But when it fails, remember who warned you. I smiled. I'll remember exactly who underestimated me. The meeting adjourned with papers rustling and side conversations echoing through the room. Nathan lingered behind as the others left. That could have gone worse. It could have gone better, I said. He chuckled. Progress is never pretty. We walked out together into the hallway, where the morning light bathed the models of past Ellington projects. You know, he said, Alexander would have loved this idea. I hope so, I whispered. Because I'm doing it for him, and for every kid like me who almost gave up. 2 weeks later, the first round of applications arrived, hundreds of portfolios each, a mosaic of hope and ambition. I spent nights in the studio reviewing them with Nathan and Olivia, the 3 of us surrounded by stacks of resumes and coffee cups. This one, Nathan said, holding up a portfolio bound in brown paper. Emma Rodriguez, 22. Works 3 jobs, designs shelters for the homeless in her spare time. I flipped through her drawings, simple but brilliant, every line purposeful. She sees architecture as empathy, I said softly. She's in. By the end of the week, we had our 12 fellows. The youngest was 21, the oldest 29. Some came from prestigious schools, others from none at all. They arrived at headquarters wide-eyed, nervous, and full of questions. When I stepped into the atrium to greet them, I saw my younger self in every face, the hunger to prove, the fear of failing, the desperate hope that someone would finally say, "You belong here." Welcome to Ellington Design, I said. You're not here as students. You're here as architects. You'll learn, fail, argue, and create. You'll make mistakes and we'll build from them, just like my uncle taught me. Emma raised her hand shyly. Miss Ellington, why us? I smiled. Because you remind me of what this company used to stand for, building not just for beauty but for people. The next few weeks were chaos disguised as progress. The fellows threw themselves into the Savannah Community Library project, sketching, modeling, debating late into the night. Nathan and I supervised, alternating between mentors and referees. Emma was the quiet one, always sketching in corners, her designs infused with warmth and compassion. When I reviewed her concept, a circular reading hall lined with glass walls opening toward a public garden, I felt something stir in me. This, I told her, is what architecture should feel like. She blinked, unsure if I was serious. Really, yes. Don't let anyone make you doubt it. Word about the fellowship spread quickly. The Savannah Chronicle ran a front-page story, from heir to visionary Grace Ellington revives her uncle's legacy. Soon, design blogs and architecture forums were buzzing. The public loved it. Investors began calling. But success never comes without shadows. Late one evening, as I walked past the executive floor, I overheard voices in Oliver's office. His door was slightly ajar. She's making you look like the villain, said a woman's voice. I recognized as Carmela Price, one of our investors. The press adores her. Oliver's tone was low, venomous. Let them. Every empire built on sentiment eventually collapses. All I need is one mistake, one scandal, and she'll crumble. The board will beg me to take over. My chest tightened. I stepped back before he could see me, my heels echoing too loudly in the corridor. That night, I sat alone in my studio replaying his words. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt clarity. He wanted me to fail so badly he couldn't see what I'd already learned. I didn't need to fight him. I just needed to keep building. The next morning, we hosted the official launch of the fellowship. The atrium was packed, press, investors, employees, students. Cameras flashed as I stepped up to the podium beneath a banner that read "Building the Future." I took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. My uncle believed architecture could heal. That belief built this company. The Ellington Fellowship isn't about charity, it's about legacy. Every blueprint we draw is a promise that the spaces we build can make life better for someone else. Today we begin that work again. Applause filled the room, thunderous and long. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Oliver watching from the balcony above, his expression unreadable. Afterward, the fellows crowded around, their excitement contagious. Emma held up her sketchbook. "Miss Ellington, look. I reworked the facade like you suggested. It catches more light in the morning." I studied the drawing, heart swelling with pride. "It's perfect," she smiled. "Then we'll build it that way." When the crowd thinned, I stood alone in the atrium, surrounded by echoes of applause and the faint hum of possibility. For the first time since inheriting this empire, I didn't feel like an imposter. I felt like an architect. As I left for the night, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message was short. "Watch your back, Miss Ellington." I froze, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I exhaled, slowly locking my phone. "The lights of the fellowship glowed bright tonight," I whispered. But so did the shadows. Outside, Savannah shimmered under the streetlights, beautiful and fragile. And for the first time, I understood that rebuilding wasn't just about creating something new. It was about surviving what tried to destroy you. 3 months later, the Ellington Fellowship had become the heartbeat of the company. The Savannah Community Library was halfway through construction, and every week reporters appeared at the site to photograph the young architects shaping steel and glass into something alive. I had never seen the office hum with this much energy. Designers were staying late again, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The walls were filling with new sketches, laughter echoed through the halls, and for the first time, Ellington design felt like what my uncle had described, a place that built not just buildings but people. The press called it my redemption arc. The phrase made me uneasy, but I didn't correct it. Let them write their stories. I knew the truth: this wasn't redemption. It was reclamation. One evening I stood by the river watching the steel frame of the library rise against the orange sky. My reflection in the water looked different now, stronger, more certain. I whispered, "We're getting there, Uncle." That's when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something in me hesitated. Grace Ellington. The voice was smooth, familiar in the worst way. My stomach turned to ice. "Ethan." There was a pause, just long enough for the sound of the river to rush between us. "You sound surprised," he said. "I saw your name in Architectural Digest." "Congratulations." I closed my eyes. Don't what call to congratulate my ex-wife for becoming the poster child for reinvention. You always did have a flair for drama. My pulse thudded. "What do you want?" I thought maybe we could meet. "Just coffee. Closure." "There's nothing left to close, Ethan." His voice softened, false and practiced. "Grace, I made mistakes. I see that now. I've changed." I almost laughed. "You've rehearsed that line before, haven't you?" "Please," he said, voice cracking. "Just enough to sound human. 10 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe I wanted to see him once more to prove to myself that the person who'd destroyed me no longer had power. We met the next day at a cafe downtown, public enough that I felt safe. He arrived in a tailored suit, same expensive watch, same predatory confidence wrapped in charm. You look incredible, he said, sliding into the seat across from me. Savannah suits you. I ignored the compliment. Say what you came to say, he sighed dramatically. I lost everything after you left. The business went under. Investors pulled out. It was karma, I guess. You don't believe in karma, I said flatly. He smiled. Maybe I do now. I've been thinking, Grace, we could rebuild together. You've got the company, the name. I still have contacts. Imagine what we could. I stood. We're done here. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist. You wouldn't even have this life if it weren't for me. I made you. I stared at him, steady and calm. You broke me. I made me. The look on his face, shock, anger, something else I couldn't name, told me he'd finally realized I wasn't his anymore. I pulled free and walked out, sunlight burning the back of my neck like a seal of freedom. I thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, Olivia burst into my office holding her phone. You need to see this. A tabloid headline glared up at me. Grace Ellington's fairy tale story isn't what it seems. Below it, subheading screamed, sources claim ex-husband funded her education. Did she steal Ellington's empire? My stomach turned. He didn't. He did, Olivia said grimly. And he's been talking to reporters for days. Guess who's bankrolling his new truth-telling podcast? I didn't have to guess. Oliver Grant. We met that night in my office, me, Nathan, and Olivia, trying to plan a response. We can't ignore this, Nathan said. They're questioning your legitimacy. Investors are nervous, which is exactly what Oliver wants, Olivia added. He's using Ethan as a distraction while he lobbies the board to remove you. I leaned back, hands clasped, pulse steady. Then we don't fight the lie. We tell the truth, Nathan frowned. You want to go public, yes. I've hidden my past long enough. The next morning, I held a press conference in the Ellington atrium. Cameras flashed as I stepped to the podium. My reflection shimmered faintly in the marble floor beneath me, standing taller than it had ever been. I've seen the headlines, I began. Some are calling me a fraud, some are calling me lucky. Here's the truth: I was married to a man who told me my dreams were worthless. He took everything from me. I left with nothing but my education and my will to survive. Every brick in this company, every project we've built under my leadership came from that will. The room was silent. I didn't build this empire because someone gave it to me. I built it because someone told me I couldn't. If that's fraud, then call me guilty. Someone started clapping, then another. The sound swelled until it filled the atrium like thunder. I saw flashes of cameras, tears in a few eyes, and something even more powerful, a flicker of belief. That night, number built by Grace trended across social media. The narrative flipped. Women from around the world sent messages, architects, single mother survivors. You gave me courage, one read. You made me believe it's not too late to rebuild. But not everyone was celebrating. Oliver's plan backfired spectacularly, and he knew it. His investor, Carmela Price, cornered him during a networking gala. You said she'd crumble, she hissed. Instead, she's a national hero. Give it time, Oliver snapped. Heroes always fall. The next day, Ethan called again. This time, I didn't answer. He texted instead, we should talk. For both our sakes, I deleted the message. But when Olivia stormed into my office that afternoon, her expression made my blood run cold. He's not giving up. He just filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles claiming part ownership of Ellington Design. I stared at her. On what grounds? He's arguing that your architectural skills were marital assets developed during your marriage? It's nonsense, but it'll make headlines. Nathan's jaw tightened. He's being funded again. Guess by who? I didn't need to ask. Oliver. The anger that rose inside me wasn't hot this time, it was cold, clean, sharp. Then they've both chosen war. That evening, I sat in my uncle's study, the rain beginning to fall against the windows, and opened one of his sketchbooks. Inside the cover, written in his looping script, were 6 words: strength is built from what breaks you. I smiled through the ache. Then I'm stronger than they know. Nathan found me there hours later. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. "I'm better than okay." He studied me for a moment. "You know they're coming for blood, right?" "I know," I said. "And I'm done hiding mine." The next morning, I sent one message to Olivia Call, our lawyer. "We're countersuing for harassment and defamation. If Ethan wanted a war, he'd have one. But this time I wasn't fighting for survival. I was fighting for justice, and I was going to win." The sound of the rain outside Los Angeles Superior Court was relentless tapping against the tall glass windows like impatient fingers. Olivia sat beside me at the long table, her expression calm but razor-sharp. Across from us, Ethan Monroe leaned back in his chair, looking smug in an expensive gray suit. He had always dressed like he owned the room even when he didn't. The judge entered. We stood. My heart thudded not from fear this time, but from clarity. 10 years ago, I'd walked into a courtroom to sign away everything I owned. Today, I was here to reclaim the part of me he'd tried to erase. Ethan's attorney began first. "Your Honor, my client seeks recognition of intellectual and financial contribution during the marriage to the skills and reputation that now define Miss Ellington's success. Her architectural knowledge cultivated while Mr. Monroe supported her financially constitutes marital property." The words echoed like poison through the room. He was trying to claim ownership of my mind. Olivia stood smoothly. "Objection, Your Honor. Miss Ellington's career began after the dissolution of that marriage. There were no joint ventures, no business shared, and certainly no emotional or financial support provided. Mr. Monroe's claim is an attempt to profit from abuse, not partnership." The judge nodded. "Continue." Ethan leaned forward, voice soft, performative. "Grace, I only want what's fair." I met his gaze steady. "You wouldn't recognize fair if it paid your bills." He blinked, momentarily thrown off script. His lawyer quickly interjected, waving a folder. "Your Honor, we have evidence of emails and drafts of architectural designs produced during the marriage, proof of her developing her skill under his roof." Olivia's tone sharpened. "Under his roof? The same roof where he restricted her communication, controlled her bank accounts, and sabotaged her professional opportunities. We have journals, messages, and testimony from acquaintances documenting emotional abuse and coercive control." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have those records, Miss Park?" "Yes, Your Honor." Olivia handed the clerk a thick binder. The court fell silent as pages turned. Inside were the journals I had found weeks ago, the ones where I had documented everything, every insult, every manipulation, every night, spent quietly sketching in secret while Ethan snored beside me. The judge read one aloud. He said I was too small for big dreams. I said big dreams were the only thing keeping me alive. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of papers and Ethan's shallow breathing. Olivia clasped her hands on the table. "Your Honor, my client's so-called skills weren't developed through his generosity. They survived in spite of his cruelty. The only contribution he made to her career was teaching her exactly what kind of architect she'd never become, one who destroys rather than builds." The judge's expression didn't change, but the shift in the room was palpable. Ethan's confidence faltered. "Mr. Monroe," the judge said, "this evidence paints a disturbing picture. It appears your claims may not only lack merit but also constitute harassment. Would you like to proceed?" Ethan's lawyer hesitated, glancing at him. Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're proceeding," he snapped. The judge sighed. "Very well." The hearing lasted hours. Ethan's side tried to spin a narrative of sacrifice, how he had supported me emotionally and financially. But every time they built a wall, Olivia tore it down brick by brick. She read texts where he belittled my degree, emails where he mocked my work. She presented the prenup he'd forced me to sign, ensuring I left the marriage penniless. By the time the sun dipped low behind the courthouse windows, the air in the room had changed. Finally, the judge looked up. "I've heard enough." Ethan's attorney tried to speak, but she raised her hand. "Mr. Monroe's case is dismissed in full. The court finds no legal basis for his claim. Furthermore, the court recognizes Miss Ellington's countersuit for defamation and harassment. We'll reconvene in 30 days for damages assessment. Ethan's face drained of color, his hands clenched on the table. You can't do this. I supported her for years. The judge's voice was firm. Supporting your spouse does not entitle you to own them. Olivia smiled faintly. That'll be all, Your Honor. When we stepped outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, cutting through the lingering drizzle. Reporters swarmed near the courthouse steps, microphones flashing. Miss Ellington, how does it feel to win one? Shouted. I stopped, looked straight at the cameras and said, it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like ending. The word spread within hours. Architect Grace Ellington wins landmark case for emotional abuse survivors. My phone filled with messages, architects, women, strangers. Some thanked me. Some just wrote, you spoke for me. That night, back in Savannah, the Ellington estate was quiet. The fire burned low in the study. Margaret brought tea and left without a word, her eyes misty with pride. Nathan arrived later, his jacket still damp from the storm outside. I saw the footage, he said. You didn't just win, you set a precedent. I smiled tiredly. Maybe. Or maybe I just got lucky. He shook his head. No, you were brave. I stared into the fire. He tried to own every part of me. My time, my work, my voice. It took me 10 years to realize I didn't owe him a single piece. Nathan leaned on the mantel beside me. That's not revenge. That's justice. Maybe they're the same thing, I said softly. The next morning, the Savannah Chronicle ran a headline that made me laugh out loud. Grace Ellington, the woman who designed her own freedom. By noon, the story had gone national. Architecture magazines praised the firm's ethics, law journals analyzed the case, and talk shows invited me to speak about rebuilding after abuse. But not everyone celebrated. Oliver appeared at my office door that afternoon, dressed in another immaculate suit, his face unreadable. Congratulations, he said smoothly. A victory for women everywhere, I'm sure. What do you want, Oliver? He closed the door behind him, the faintest smirk curving his lips, a reminder that this victory changes nothing between us. Public sympathy won't protect you forever. The board still wants results, and sentiment doesn't pay salaries. Neither does sabotage, I said. You tried to ruin me with Ethan. How'd that work out? He didn't flinch. Careful, Grace. You've made powerful enemies. I've made the right ones, I said quietly, and I'm not afraid of them. He dropped an envelope on my desk. Then consider this your next test. After he left, I opened it. Inside was a formal offer, Grant and Weaver Holdings, proposing to buy Ellington Design Group for $400 million. I stared at the number. It was enough to make anyone walk away. Enough to erase the past forever, but I couldn't move, because tucked beneath the letter was a note written in Oliver's hand. Everything has a price. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the studio past my uncle's models and sketches until I reached the old Bridge of Light. The miniature arches gleamed under the lamplight, fragile but unbroken. I thought about Alexander, about the years he'd spent teaching me that true architecture wasn't about what you built, it was about what you refused to destroy. He'd told me once, some legacies can't be sold, only guarded. I touched the bridge, feeling its smooth metal beneath my fingers, and whispered, then let this be my guardrail. The next morning I looked out over the Savannah River. The city glowed beneath the sunrise, a living monument to resilience. I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and began drafting my reply to Grant and Weaver Holdings. The subject line read, Offer rejected. And as I pressed send, a quiet calm settled over me. Ethan had lost his power. Oliver was losing his grip, and I had never stood taller. The letter from Grant and Weaver sat on my desk like a loaded gun. $400 million. Enough to secure every future, erase every fear. For a moment, I simply stared at it, the words blurring together. My uncle had built this company brick by brick, dream by dream, and now someone wanted to buy it like a piece of real estate. Nathan stood across from me, his brow furrowed. You know what this means, don't you? If you take it, you can walk away. No more board politics, no, Oliver. Peace, peace. I repeated, a faint laugh escaping. Selling Ellington isn't peace, it's surrender. He stepped closer. Grace, it's $400 million. I met his eyes. It's also my uncle's legacy. The next morning, the board convened in the glass conference room. The city spread out beneath us like a map of possibilities and consequences. I arrived early, standing by the window as the others filed in. Oliver, at the head of the table, his usual calm edged with something sharper. He placed a copy of the offer in front of each member. Ladies and gentlemen, Grant and Weaver Holdings is proposing a complete acquisition of Ellington Design Group for $400 million. That's double our current valuation. Every shareholder stands to benefit. He looked directly at me. Unless, of course, our CEO decides her pride is worth more than profit. I stayed silent. Olivia sat to my right, her posture stiff. Nathan was beside her, arms crossed, gaze fixed on Oliver. One of the older board members cleared his throat. We should at least consider it. The industry is volatile. A buyout ensures stability. And what about purpose? I asked quietly. What about what we stand for? Oliver smiled thinly. Legacy doesn't pay salaries, Miss Ellington. The world remembers results, not intentions. I looked at him, really looked. You've spent so long chasing profit that you've forgotten what architecture is. It's not about ownership, it's about impact. My uncle didn't build this firm to sell it. He built it to outlast him. Your uncle built it, Oliver said sharply, but you inherited it. There's a difference. You're right, I said. He built it with his hands. I'm building it with my choices. And this one is simple. I turned to the board. We're not selling. A murmur rippled through the room. Oliver slammed his hand on the table. You can't decide this alone. Yes, I can, I said, my voice calm but cutting. As majority shareholder, I hold 51%. The vote is symbolic. The tension in the room was electric. Then, before anyone could speak, Olivia rose. Actually, Mr. Grant, there's something the board needs to see. She held up a sealed document. The wax seal bore my uncle's initials. This is an addendum to Alexander Ellington's will. It was to be opened only in the event of a major acquisition offer. Oliver's expression flickered for the first time. That's impossible. I reviewed all. You reviewed what you were allowed to see, Olivia interrupted. This came directly from the estate's legal trust. She broke the seal and began to read. If my heir rejects any substantial acquisition offer for the sake of preserving Ellington Design's purpose, she shall receive an additional trust of $30 million unrestricted. Because some legacies cannot be bought, they can only be protected. The room fell into stunned silence. My chest tightened. Even in death, Alexander was still teaching me. This was his final test. Oliver's chair screeched against the floor as he stood. So he manipulated you even from the grave. I turned toward him slowly. No, he believed in me enough to make sure I remembered who I was. He glared at me. You think this makes you invincible? That letter doesn't change the fact that this company needs leadership grounded in reality. I walked to the front of the room and picked up a marker. The glass wall gleamed behind me, a blank canvas waiting for truth. In bold strokes, I wrote 3 words, "We are not selling." Then I turned to face them. This company was never about luxury or status. It was about people. About building spaces that mean something. Every bridge, every school, every home we design is a promise to honor the past and protect the future. That's what Ellington stands for. That's what we'll keep building. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly Nathan began to clap. Olivia joined him. A few others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger. Oliver stared at me, his lips curling into a bitter smile. Well done, Grace. You've just made yourself the most powerful woman in this company and the most vulnerable. He gathered his papers and turned to leave. But mark my words, power never lasts forever. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled. My hands were trembling. Nathan came to my side. You just buried him in his own game. I didn't bury him, I said. I freed us. That evening, the board meeting became the talk of Savannah's business district. Reporters called it the stand that saved Ellington. By sunset, the story had spread nationwide. My phone buzzed nonstop messages from clients, supporters, even students. Thank you for proving integrity still matters. I stayed late at the office. The others had gone home, the city glowing beyond the windows. When I finally turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway, I saw Nathan waiting by the elevator. You didn't have to wait, I said. He shrugged. You shouldn't have to face an empty building after a day like this. We walked out together into the soft evening air. The scent of rain lingered and the Savannah skyline glimmered in reflected gold. He hesitated before speaking. Alexander would have been proud. I smiled faintly. I think he already told me that in his own way. Nathan's voice softened. You've spent so long fighting, Grace. Maybe it's time you start living again. The honesty in his tone caught me off guard. I looked up at him, the man who had stood beside me through every battle, who never doubted even when I did. I don't know how, I admitted. He smiled. Then we'll figure it out together. He reached out his hand, finding mine. It wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was quiet, inevitable. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the world alone. Later, I returned to the estate. The house was still, the air thick with memories and peace. On my desk, a small velvet box waited, placed there by Margaret. A note sat beside it in her handwriting. He wanted you to have this after you passed your final test. Inside was a ring, a simple band etched with tiny blueprints spiraling along the metal. My Aunt Eleanor's ring. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Tears welled in my eyes. You never stopped believing, did you? I whispered. I stood by the window looking out over the sleeping city my uncle had loved so much. Savannah glowed like the model of a dream come true. He had tested me again and again, not to see if I would win, but to make sure I would never forget what mattered. And I hadn't. The ring caught the light as I lifted my hand, the reflection scattering across the glass like a promise. I'll keep building, Uncle, I said softly. Not just what you started, but what comes next. Outside, dawn began to rise, painting the horizon in gold. And for the first time in years, I didn't see a legacy to protect. I saw a future to create. The sun was just rising over the Savannah skyline when the ribbon fluttered in my hands. The morning air smelled of rain and new beginnings, soft and clean. The crowd gathered below the gleaming glass facade of the Savannah Community Library, our first fellowship project, our promise made real. Reporters clustered near the steps. Children held balloons. And I stood beside Nathan, my heart steady, in a way it hadn't been in years. If someone had told me 2 years ago that people would cheer for the woman they once called trash, I whispered I'd have laughed. Nathan smiled, squeezing my hand. They're not cheering for the woman they used to know. They're cheering for who you became. The ribbon cutting began. Emma, radiant and confident, stood at the microphone, her voice clear. This library was designed by people who were told their dreams didn't matter. But today we open a space where every dream is welcome. The crowd erupted in applause. I felt tears blur my vision as the scissors closed and the ribbon fell. The glass doors swung open, sunlight spilling across the marble floors inside, illuminating the words carved into the entrance, "Architecture is redemption made visible." My uncle's words, his legacy. Inside, children ran past shelves of books under skylights we'd designed to catch natural light. Community members explored the reading gardens. Emma had envisioned benches blooming with local flowers. The entire building breathed with life. I gave a short speech, though my voice trembled through the first few sentences. This library isn't just a building, I said. It's a promise that no one is beyond rebuilding. My uncle Alexander Ellington believed that architecture should serve the soul. Today we honor that belief. I paused, looking toward the sky beyond the atrium glass. Uncle, we did it. The applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed, but all I saw were faces, young, old, hopeful faces that reminded me of why we built in the first place. That night, the celebration continued back at the estate. Margaret had transformed the rooftop garden into something magical: string lights, flowers, laughter floating through the warm air. The entire fellowship team was there, dressed up but relaxed, the exhaustion of hard work replaced by pure joy. Emma raised a glass. To Miss Ellington for giving us a future. I shook my head, smiling. No. To all of you for proving that legacy isn't inherited, it's earned. Laughter and applause followed, and I felt something settle deep in my chest, a quiet, unshakable peace. Nathan appeared beside me, carrying a framed sketch. A gift, he said. I turned it over. It was my first design, the one I'd drawn years ago in my uncle's old studio when I still believed dreams were safe things. Now it hung beside Alexander's masterpieces in the estate's main hall. My past finally belonged to my present. As the night softened, Margaret leaned close, her eyes shining. He'd be so proud, dear girl. He used to say you'd build something greater than him. I think you already have. Later, when the guests had gone and the city lights glimmered beyond the terrace, Nathan and I sat together under the stars. You know, he said you could walk away now, retire, rest. You've already done what you came to do. I laughed softly. You don't retire from purpose. He looked at me, eyes warm. Then what comes next? I turned toward the city. We build. Always. The months that followed passed like a quiet symphony. The Ellington Fellowship expanded nationwide, mentoring architects from every background. Emma led her own project, a women's shelter she called the Grace Center for Renewal. The name embarrassed me at first, but when I saw it printed on the cornerstone, I understood it wasn't about me. It was about what we'd all survived. I stepped down as full-time CEO, naming Nathan as co-CEO. He protested, of course, but I told him leadership was meant to be shared. I focused instead on teaching and designing again the way I'd always wanted. One afternoon at a university lecture, a student raised her hand. "Do you ever regret what happened?" she asked timidly. I smiled. No. Every broken piece of my story became part of the foundation of who I am. If I hadn't lost everything, I might never have discovered what really mattered. When the lecture ended, the students lined up to talk, and I realized something unexpected. I wasn't their idol. I was their mirror. Each of them saw a piece of themselves in my story, and that was worth more than any award or inheritance. Spring arrived in Savannah with soft winds and long golden evenings. The city was thriving, the riverfront alive with new projects, laughter, and hope. The Ellington name had become a symbol of rebirth, not wealth. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city, I stood again on the rooftop of the estate, the place where everything had begun. The air smelled of magnolia and rain. The skyline shimmered with the lights of buildings we'd designed, each one carrying a story, a heartbeat, a piece of what we'd learned. Nathan joined me, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. We watched the lights come on across the river, one by one, like a constellation being born. "Do you ever miss him?" he asked quietly. "Every day," I said. "But not with sadness anymore, more like gratitude. He didn't just leave me a company, he left me courage." Nathan kissed the top of my head. "You gave that courage back to everyone else." I smiled, eyes still on the skyline. Maybe that's what legacy really is, passing the light forward. Below us, the library glowed, the glass reflecting stars. Children's laughter drifted faintly through the night, and I thought of the girl I used to be, the one digging through dumpsters for furniture covered in dust and shame. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her, "You're not broken. You're just unfinished." I'd tell her that one day she'd build an empire from the ruins. And I'd tell her she'd finally understand why the people who called her trash were wrong. Because sometimes the most extraordinary things begin in the dirt. I turned to Nathan, taking his hand. "We did it," I whispered. He smiled. "No, Grace. You did." The wind carried the sound of the river below, calm and endless. Somewhere I imagined Alexander smiling too. I looked at the city one last time before heading inside. "Let's get back to work," I said softly. "There's always something worth building." As the screen faded to black, my voice lingered like a letter written to anyone still standing in the dark. If you've ever been told you'll never rise, that you're too broken or too late, remember these foundations are built from the ground up. You just have to start. Tell me in the comments what you're rebuilding from. I read every story because this channel isn't just about revenge, it's about rebirth. Don't forget to subscribe, stay and grow with us. The next story might just remind you that rock bottom isn't the end, it's the beginning of everything beautiful.